You think you're in control, don't you? You believe that the decisions you make, the thoughts you think, the emotions you feel, all of this is a result of your conscious will, your reason, your authentic self. But what if I told you that this is precisely the illusion that is destroying your life? That this you who thinks they are in command is just a mask, a carefully constructed character designed to survive in a world that demands performance over authenticity. I'm not here to comfort you with pleasant lies. I'm here to confront you with a truth that Carl Jung spent his entire career revealing behind every successful person, every people pleaser, every perfectionist. There's a fragile ego desperately trying to maintain control while slowly suffocating the soul underneath. Maybe you're too hard on yourself, constantly seeking approval from people whose opinions shouldn't matter. Maybe you have everything that society calls success but still feel hollow inside, like you're living someone else's life. Maybe you sabotage good opportunities, push away genuine connections, or find yourself trapped in the same destructive patterns no matter how hard you try to change. Do you know why? Because your ego, this small, frightened part of your psyche that believes it's protecting you, is actually the warden of your own prison. And today we're going to perform an autopsy on this illusion you call your identity. Carl Jung understood that the ego isn't evil. It's simply limited and terrified of its own limitations. The ego is the center of your conscious personality, the I that you identify with when you say, I am successful, I am strong, or I am in control. But Jung discovered something revolutionary. This I is just a small island in the vast ocean of your complete psychological being. The ego develops around age 4. As a child's first attempt to create identity and security in an overwhelming world. But here's the problem. It never stops thinking it needs to protect you like you're still that vulnerable 4-year-old. Jung saw that the ego's primary function is to construct a socially acceptable version of yourself, editing out anything that might lead to rejection, shame, or loss of control. It creates what Jung called the persona, your social mask designed to win approval and avoid conflict. But this editing process comes at a devastating cost. You begin to lose touch with your authentic nature, your shadow, your deeper wisdom, your capacity for genuine connection. The ego convinces you that you are this limited, socially conditioned version of yourself, and any threat to this identity feels like death. This is why changing habits feels impossible, why authentic relationships feel terrifying, why success often brings emptiness rather than fulfillment. Jung realized that most human suffering comes from this fundamental misidentification. We mistake our protective mechanisms for our true nature. Meet David, a 34-year-old marketing executive who has achieved every goal his ego set for him and feels more empty than ever. David's LinkedIn profile reads like a success story, promoted 3 times in 5 years, owns a downtown condo, drives a luxury car, and maintains a carefully curated social media presence that generates exactly the kind of envy and admiration his ego craves. But David's real life tells a different story. He works 70-hour weeks not because he loves his job, but because stopping would mean confronting the hollow feeling that something essential is missing from his life. His relationships are transactional. He networks instead of connecting, dates people who look good on paper instead of those who stir his soul, and maintains friendships based on mutual benefit rather than genuine affection. David's ego has convinced him that this lifestyle is success, but his body tells a different story. Chronic insomnia, digestive issues, a constant sense of anxiety that no amount of achievement seems to cure. He medicates these symptoms with expensive distractions, shopping, travel, trendy restaurants, fitness regimens that look impressive but feel compulsive. What David doesn't realize is that every choice he's made for the past decade has been filtered through his ego's fear-based agenda: avoid vulnerability, maintain image, stay in control, prove worth through external validation. His authentic desires, his childhood love of music, his longing for meaningful work, his need for genuine intimacy have been systematically edited out of his life because they felt too risky for his ego to allow. Jung called the persona our social mask, the carefully crafted personality we present to the world to gain acceptance and avoid rejection. David's persona is that of the successful, confident, having it all executive. But Jung understood that the more we identify with our persona, the more we lose touch with our authentic nature. David's persona was built in response to childhood messages: that love was conditional on achievement, that vulnerability was weakness, that his worth depended on impressing others. Over time, this mask became so convincing that David forgot it was a performance. He began to believe that he was this successful, controlled, impressive character. But Jung knew that living primarily through the persona creates what he called persona inflation. You become addicted to the role you're playing, even when it's making you miserable. David needs constant external validation to maintain his sense of self-worth, because the persona, unlike authentic identity, is inherently unstable and dependent on others' opinions. This is why David feels threatened when colleagues question his ideas, why he works obsessively to maintain his image, why criticism feels like a personal attack rather than useful feedback. Jung observed that people who over-identify with their persona often experience what he called the breakdown of the persona later in life, a psychological crisis where the mask becomes too heavy to maintain. David is approaching this breakdown, though he doesn't recognize the signs yet. The increasing anxiety, the sense of emptiness despite external success, the growing difficulty in maintaining relationships, these are all symptoms of a psyche crying out for authenticity. Everything David has rejected about himself, his need for genuine connection, his artistic impulses, his vulnerability, his anger at living inauthentically, hasn't disappeared. Carl Jung called this rejected material the shadow, and it doesn't stay quietly buried. Instead, it manifests in ways David doesn't recognize or understand. His workaholism masks a deep fear of intimacy. If he's always busy, he never has to risk genuine emotional connection. His need to control every situation stems from terror of the chaos he might feel if he let his guard down. His contempt for emotional or impractical people is actually projection. He's rejecting these qualities in himself so forcefully that he can't tolerate seeing them in others. Jung understood that what we resist in others often reveals what we've rejected in ourselves. David finds himself inexplicably irritated by colleagues who take time off, friends who pursue creative careers, or anyone who seems comfortable with uncertainty or emotional expression. This isn't because he's naturally judgmental. It's because these people represent the aspects of himself his ego has deemed unacceptable. The shadow also manifests in David's self-sabotaging behaviors. Despite his professional success, he consistently undermines his own happiness, pushing away romantic partners when they get too close, declining social invitations that might lead to real friendship, avoiding activities that might bring joy but don't serve his image. Jung called this shadow possession, when the rejected parts of yourself begin controlling your behavior unconsciously. David's ego thinks it's protecting him by maintaining control, but it's actually creating the very isolation and emptiness it's trying to avoid. David's ego structure finally cracks during what should have been his greatest professional triumph, being promoted to senior vice president. At the celebration dinner, surrounded by congratulating colleagues and envious competitors, David feels absolutely nothing. Not pride, not satisfaction, not even relief, just a hollow emptiness that terrifies him more than any failure ever could. That night, alone in his expensive apartment, David experiences what Jung called the dark night of the soul, the moment when the ego's promises of security and happiness are revealed as illusions. For the first time in years, David allows himself to ask the question his ego has been desperately suppressing: is this really my life? Is this who I actually want to be? The question opens a floodgate of suppressed awareness. He realizes he can't remember the last time he did something purely for joy, the last time he had a conversation that wasn't strategic, the last time he felt genuinely excited about his future rather than just relieved about avoiding failure. Jung understood that these crisis moments, while painful, are actually invitations to psychological wholeness. The ego's breakdown creates space for the authentic self to emerge. David's carefully maintained image suddenly feels like a straitjacket, his success feels like a prison sentence, and his relationships feel like business transactions. This isn't depression, it's awakening. For the first time in decades, David is glimpsing the difference between who he's been performing as and who he actually is underneath all the achievement and control. I want you to pause and examine your own relationship with your ego. When you think about your daily decisions, how many are made from authentic desire versus ego protection? Are you living your life, or are you living the life you think will gain approval, avoid criticism, or maintain an image? Jung believed that most people spend their entire lives serving their ego's agenda without realizing it. Consider this: when you choose what to wear, what to say in social situations, what career moves to make, what relationships to pursue or avoid, how much of that is coming from your authentic self versus your ego's fear-based calculations? Here's a deeper question that might disturb you. What would you do differently if you knew no one would judge you? If success and failure as defined by society became irrelevant, if you could disappoint people without losing their love, the parts of yourself you're most afraid to show others, the dreams you've abandoned because they seemed impractical, the emotions you suppress because they don't fit your image. These might be breadcrumbs leading back to your authentic nature. Share in the comments one area of your life where you suspect your ego has been making decisions for you. Not to judge yourself, but to begin the process of conscious recognition that Jung saw as the first step towards psychological freedom. Jung's approach to healing the ego's tyranny wasn't to destroy it, but to put it in its proper place as servant rather than master. This process, called individuation, requires what Jung called holding the tension of opposites, acknowledging both your ego's protective function and its limitations. David began this work by practicing what Jung called active imagination, consciously dialoguing with the different aspects of his personality. Instead of identifying completely with his professional persona, he began observing it. There's the part of me that needs to impress people, rather than I need to impress people. This simple shift created psychological space between his authentic self and his ego's compulsions. David started making small choices that honored his suppressed desires rather than his image. He took piano lessons for the first time since childhood, not to become a performer, but simply because music brought him joy. He began saying no to networking events that drained him, and yes to activities that nourished something deeper. Most challengingly, he started allowing people to see his vulnerabilities, sharing his doubts with trusted friends, admitting when he didn't know something, letting others witness his humanity rather than just his achievements. Jung understood that integration is gradual and often uncomfortable. David's ego resisted these changes, creating anxiety, guilt, and fear that he was losing his edge or becoming weak. But as David continued choosing authenticity over image, he noticed something remarkable. His relationships deepened, his creativity returned, and his anxiety began to decrease. He was learning the difference between ego strength, maintaining image through control, and authentic strength, being genuine regardless of others' reaction. 6 months into his individuation process, David's life looked different from both the outside and inside. Professionally, he was still successful, but his relationship with success had changed completely. He now chose projects based on meaning and values, rather than just advancement opportunities. He delegated more effectively because he no longer needed to control every detail to feel secure. His leadership style shifted from commanding respect through authority to earning it through authenticity and genuine care for his team's development. Personally, David's relationships underwent a profound transformation. He ended a long-term relationship that had been based on mutual image enhancement rather than genuine love, and began dating someone who challenged him to be real rather than impressive. His friendships evolved from networking connections to authentic bonds with people who knew and accepted his complete self, including his struggles and uncertainties. Most surprisingly to David, his performance at work actually improved as he became more authentic. His creativity increased, his decision-making became clearer, and his ability to inspire others grew stronger. Jung had predicted this: when the ego stops using so much energy to maintain false personas and suppress authentic impulses, that energy becomes available for genuine creativity and connection. David learned that the ego's promise of security through control was actually creating the insecurity it claimed to prevent. Real security, he discovered, came from being genuinely himself and trusting that authentic relationships and meaningful work would follow. David's journey reflects patterns Jung observed in countless individuals across cultures and centuries. The ego's basic strategy remains consistent across all human experiences. Create a socially acceptable identity, suppress anything that threatens this identity, and maintain control through performance and external validation. This pattern manifests differently for everyone: the perfectionist, whose ego demands flawless performance; the people pleaser, whose ego avoids conflict at all costs; the rebel, whose ego defines itself through opposition; the victim, whose ego maintains identity through suffering. But the underlying mechanism is the same: a frightened part of the psyche has convinced you that your survival depends on being someone other than who you authentically are. Jung observed that entire cultures can be dominated by collective ego patterns, societies that prioritize image over substance, competition over collaboration, having over being. These cultural ego patterns reinforce individual ones, creating cycles where people feel pressured to maintain personas that ultimately leave them feeling isolated and unfulfilled. The modern epidemic of anxiety, depression, and existential emptiness that Jung predicted is largely the result of collective ego inflation. Entire populations living as characters in a performance rather than as authentic human beings. But Jung also saw that individual healing contributes to collective healing. When someone like David stops serving his ego's agenda and starts living authentically, it gives others permission to question their own performances. Authenticity is contagious. It challenges others to examine whether they're living their lives or merely performing roles they think will keep them safe. Jung understood that individuation isn't a destination, but a lifelong process of conscious choice between ego demands and authentic expression. David still encounters situations where his ego attempts to reassert control, especially during times of stress or when facing new challenges. The difference now is that he can recognize these moments as choice points rather than automatic responses. David developed what he calls his authenticity check. Before making important decisions, he pauses to ask whether he's choosing from fear, ego, or from genuine desire, authentic self. This practice has become second nature, but it requires ongoing vigilance because the ego is adaptive and cunning. Sometimes it disguises itself as spirituality. I'm so evolved now. Intellectual superiority. I understand psychology better than others. Or righteous authenticity. I'm just being real, when actually being self-indulgent. Jung called this spiritual inflation, when the ego co-opts even the individuation process for its own aggrandizement. David learned that true integration means neither suppressing the ego nor letting it run wild, but maintaining conscious awareness of when it's attempting to resume control. The goal isn't to eliminate ego responses, but to choose consciously when they're appropriate tools and when they're obstacles to authentic living. Some situations do require professional personas, strategic thinking, or protective boundaries. The key is conscious choice rather than unconscious compulsion. Here's the truth. Jung spent his life trying to convey your ego isn't your enemy, but it also isn't your master. It's a tool that should serve your authentic self, not rule your entire existence. The life you're living right now might feel safe, predictable, even successful by external standards. But if it requires you to constantly perform, suppress your genuine nature, or maintain exhausting levels of control, you're serving your ego's agenda rather than living your authentic life. Starting today, I challenge you to begin noticing the difference between ego-driven choices and authentic ones. When you feel the need to impress someone, ask yourself what you're afraid will happen if you're just genuinely yourself. When you find yourself judging others harshly, consider what qualities in them might reflect rejected aspects of yourself. When you feel empty despite external success, recognize this as your authentic self. Requesting attention. The individuation process Jung described isn't comfortable or quick, but it's the only path to genuine fulfillment. It requires the courage to disappoint people who prefer your performance to your authenticity, the wisdom to distinguish between healthy self-care and selfish indulgence, and the patience to rebuild your life on a foundation of truth rather than In the comments below, complete this sentence. One way I suspect my ego has been controlling my life is bricks. Don't try to fix anything, yet just practice the awareness that Jung knew was the beginning of all psychological healing. Subscribe if you're ready to explore more of Jung's insights into authentic living and the courage required to become who you truly are, rather than who you think you should be. Because the world doesn't need more perfect performances. It needs more authentic human beings willing to show up as themselves.